Hey guys, guess who's back? That was one hell of a hiatus, wasn't it? I know it's been a while, so I'm not going to waste any more of your time. Let's go. Pokemon. You know I love it. Hell, if you're watching this video, either you like it yourself, or you're wanting to find out if I'm a filthy Gen 1er or not. While I wouldn't say I hate Gen 1, it's probably my least favorite generation in the series. Yes, even below Gen 5, though I actually quite like Black and White too, but that's another video. My relationship with Gen 1 is complicated. It was my introduction to the series, my introduction to video games in general. Which, funny story, back during Pokemania in the 90s, my mother found a copy of Pokemon Blue for me in a trash can at an antique mall that she worked at. I couldn't even play it for a solid year before I got my Game Boy Color. Once I finally got to play it, it blew my mind. Up till then, I had religiously watched the TV show, so I was hooked, and I loved almost every second of playing through it. That said, it wasn't long before Gen 2 came out, and after that, my loss of interest in Gen 1 began. As far as I'm concerned, these days, Gold, Silver, and Crystal almost completely invalidate the need for Gen 1 remakes, especially when you consider Gen 2 has the Kanto Region in it. You could make the case back in the day that you needed to have Gen 1 to complete the Gen 2 Pokédex, but beyond that, there's nothing really stopping the developers from putting the Pokémon from Gen 1 into the later generations, which they eventually did. Basically what I'm getting at is that the Gen 1 games and their remakes are pointless, but the Gen 1 games and their remakes are at least interesting. Gen 1 and its remakes are unique in that the originals, needless to say, are raw, unrefined games, and the remakes, Fire Red and Leaf Green, and the reimaginings, Let's Go Pikachu and Let's Go Eevee, each take a very different approach to creating a new adaptation on the original games, which is why for this video I'll be covering Gen 1 and all of its iterations. For this video, I'll be covering Pokemon Yellow, Fire Red, and Let's Go Pikachu. Why did I pick Yellow over Blue for this video? Because it's easier to draw parallels for both Fire Red and Let's Go that way. Well, I assume most of you know the story for the Gen 1 games, but I guess for the sake of those unfamiliar, you play as a boy and or girl, beginning their Pokemon journey alongside their rival and must travel across the land to obtain badges to enter the Pokemon League, while at the same time completing the Pokédex and maybe taking down an evil organization or two. You know, it's what kids do. For the most part, all iterations of Gen 1 are consistent in the broad strokes, but the story differs in terms of minor events, and in the case of Let's Go, some roles are completely changed, but I'll get to that later. For now, I'll talk about Yellow and Fire Red. For all intents and purposes, Fire Red is going to be referenced as a stand-in for Pokemon Red and Blue for the main narrative, and a story in its own right for additional content in the remake, which in this case would be the Sevi Islands. The original plot structure of Red and Blue, and by extension Fire Red and Leaf Green, is pretty much identical to my earlier description. The plot is serviceable, but the focus is primarily on exploration. I'd say that the best thing about the story of the Gen 1 games is how Team Rocket's plotline isn't pushed in your face. Most of the events that involve them don't involve cutscene interruptions, and engaging with them in battle, while still mandatory to beat the game, feels like it's a result of your own agency as a player, and not just the game dragging you along through events. I'm not saying one method is inherently better than the other, but it's one of the more refreshing elements of returning to the first two generations of Pokemon. I particularly like how they set up the entrance to the Rocket hideout under the game corner, where you obtain the information from an NPC giving a rather on-the-nose warning about touching a poster. While the hideout is made slightly more conspicuous with the presence of Jesse and James and Let's Go in the same building, it's nonetheless still effective and keeps the hideout discovery solely in the hands of the player. And speaking of Jesse and James, that leads up to the differences. The narrative, as I mentioned, is pretty much unchanged, but there are some fun additions to Yellow and Let's Go, like the appearance of Jesse and James, as both Yellow and to a lesser extent Let's Go take a lot of influence from the old 90s anime. Yellow is much more dedicated to basing itself off the anime, since Satoshi, or Ash, were a stand-in for Red. A big part of why Let's Go feels less derivative than Yellow is because the various character changes made to the game, such as Red, Green, and Blue being effectively replaced by Chase, Elaine, and Trace. Now mind you, Red, Green, and Blue are all in Let's Go still, they just take a backseat to the new characters. Incidentally, Let's Go is the only game in the series to my knowledge to canonically feature all 4 possible playable protagonists in the same world. I guess Chase and Elaine are kinda dubious, but both can technically be present in-game with the game's co-op. Now, Trace. This character is a point of contention with a lot of players, being a quote-unquote friendly rival, and filling Blue's role understandably pissed a lot of people off. I myself was pretty apprehensive towards the change myself, but eased off when they showed that Blue was still going to be in Let's Go. I still wouldn't say I like Trace. Heck, I'd go as far as to say he's probably my least favorite rival in the series. But he does get a lot of unnecessary crap. While a lot of people like to bring up how Blue was an asshole and was always a step ahead of you during your journey and giving you the motivation to prove that you're better than him, ultimately resulting in you gaining his respect as a trainer, Trace is basically just Blue, but nice. He's always a step ahead of you, still. Seriously, if you look at the statues in the gyms, it usually says his name, but Trace isn't an asshole. Instead, he uses positive encouragement to motivate you on your journey, which I'd say isn't terribly effective, and ultimately results in a rather infamous line of dialogue after the Pokemon League where Professor Oak says Trace's kindness is the reason he lost to you, as opposed to Blue in the previous games, who lost because he wasn't kind enough. I'm honestly not sure what to say to this. What message are you trying to put across, Game Freak? Also, I didn't know where to fit this in with the story, but my favorite bit in Let's Go is a poster in Celadon City featuring an interview with Erica that reads, "Good things come to those who nap. Challengers come too." I just thought it was pretty charming, and it gave me a pretty good laugh. Alright, and I said I was going to mention the Sevi Isles. They exist. They weren't as substantial as I thought when I initially started writing this, so they're excluded. There you go. Forgettable. Just a nice addition, I guess. Next, we'll take a look at how the different iterations of Gen 1 are structured in terms of both world design and how you progress through them. As some of you might recall, I've talked about this to some extent in my unscripted ramblings about Pokemon Regions video. And as a follow-on, I said I was going to take a look at the regions in more detail when I visited the games individually. So here we all are. Kanto. Not terribly fond of the region personally. I'd even go as far as to say it's my least favorite standalone region. I mean, it's fine. It encourages more free exploration than most Pokemon games, to be sure. But on its own, it's just not typically worth traveling through by itself when I can just explore both Kanto and Johto together by playing a Gen 2 game. Personal bias aside, Kanto does have redeeming qualities, and since it wouldn't be fair to compare it to future regions, we'll just keep to judging Kanto on its own merits. Let's start off with Pallet Town. I won't be tackling every town in the game, but if there's an aspect of the world map that stands out to me, then I'll bring it up. In Pallet Town's case, it's one thing I like, and that's the water to the south of the town. It's your first exposure to an alternate route that can be capitalized later on in the game, which is great if you like avoiding Gen 1 caves like me. In this case, Seafoam Islands, and we'll talk about caves later. As it stands, this is a nice bit of freedom the game teases you with to keep in mind for later, and even if it isn't immediately apparent, the path it branches off towards can easily be seen from the game's town map in every iteration of Gen 1. Similarly, Viridian City shows you an inaccessible Pokemon gym to set your anticipation for later in the game, which is compounded by Route 22, which teases the Pokemon League, an area that remains inaccessible until you've obtained the badges from gyms. The combination of this and Viridian City Gym solidify the starting area of the game in your mind more than any other game in the series. There are various other paths blocked by small trees along Route 2 as well, but for now it's not entirely clear what the purpose of it serves. The next two areas I want to talk about are Mount Moon and Rock Tunnel, and why they're objectively terrible. For several years I've found myself asking why I always struggled to get into Gen 1 games despite the overall world design being fairly good, and it eventually clicked for me. The game's biggest flaw, and arguably the biggest pace killer of Gen 1, are Mount Moon and Rock Tunnel. There's nothing inherently bad about their design. In isolation, I'd even go as far as to say they're fairly decent as far as RPG dungeons go. But as non-optional and lengthy excursions through non-stop wild encounters with no real safe way out, without an escape rope or dig, they absolutely kill the game's overall pacing. I have a bit of a hypothesis in regards to this as well. I think the reception towards Mount Moon, and more importantly Rock Tunnel amongst the fanbase, or maybe internally among the developers, may have led to changes in future entries in which, with the exception of Victory Road and Evil Theme hideouts, the majority of caves have been made optional. What mandatory caves you do tend to come across in future entries tend to be either short, or, as of Generation 5, they'll have an NPC that will heal your party to avoid the player having to make tedious tracks back and forth from the cave, which is noticeably an issue in Generation 1. Keeping caves optional just makes venturing into them all the more interesting since they're off the beaten path. I highly doubt there are many people that would disagree with the sentiment that Mount Moon in Generation 1, and more importantly Rock Tunnel, are pretty doggone awful. That being said, Let's Go does succeed in alleviating a lot of the tedium associated with these two caves since there aren't any random encounters, and their game mechanics in place remove the need for HM. But once again, that's a topic I'm going to bring up later. For now, let's talk about more alternative routes. First of which is actually before Rock Tunnel. It's Diglett Cave. In all honesty, there's nothing terribly substantial about the cave itself. It's basically just a straight line full of Diglets and Dugtrios, meant to be a shortcut back to Pewter City and Viridian City. This is also how you obtain the HM for Flash, which is pretty much mandatory if you don't want Rock Tunnel to turn into a nightmare. Well, more of a nightmare. All in all, having a shortcut like this does a great deal in giving the game a feeling of world coherence. And it's not even the greatest example. In terms of branching paths, Saffron City is at the center, and while not immediately accessible, it serves as a converging point alongside Fuchsia City for routes 12 through 15 and 16 through 18, which includes the cycling road. After obtaining the Pokéflute, this allows you to take 2 routes to proceed onward. One might argue that the loss of experience from not going on both routes is a deterrent, but I like the option being there even if it's not one I personally take. And this brings us full circle to the Seafoam Islands, which, as I mentioned earlier, feature an alternate route I very much appreciate. By the point in the game that you've reached Fuchsia City, in all likelihood you've gotten the HM Fly, so you're presented with the option to either proceed forward as you have been and fight your way through the Seafoam Islands, which is admittedly beneficial if you want Articuno, or you can take advantage of your knowledge of Pallet Town's lower water route and take a much shorter straight shoot to Cinnabar Island. It's a brilliant little bit of game design, and whether or not it was intentional, it's something I definitely appreciate. That said, exploration isn't without its faults, most notoriously HMs, and this is going to sound like beating a dead horse, but it really does hamper the overall enjoyment of the game to an extent. Fortunately, moves like Fly and Surf are fairly beneficial in combat, but in most instances you'll be sacrificing a move slot in your party for something you may very well not want to use on a regular basis, meaning you sacrifice valuable moves on your main party or carry around an HM slave to deal with obstacles for you, which puts your team at a disadvantage. Granted, this was less of an issue in the original Generation 1 games, since most of the moves are crap anyway, but in later iterations, in this case Fire Red and Leaf Green, you may very well have to sacrifice the option for better moves to use these. Some moves are just a complete waste as well, particularly Flash, which only exists to illuminate dark caves, including Dark Cave, but Dark Cave is a Johto location, not Kanto. Fun fact! A week after writing the last few paragraphs, I realized that the cave I was referring to was Rock Tunnel, so I literally just went through the script replacing the phrase Dark Cave with Rock Tunnel. To be fair, I doubt most of you would have noticed that blunder. Dark Cave is certainly an apt description for Rock Tunnel if you ask me. Once again, Let's Go does resolve this. Following the Generation 7 trend of replacing HMs in their entirety, you now get secret techniques for your Pikachu or Eevee that allow them to perform all the tasks of an HM without the wasted move slot. However, HM moves do still exist as TMs, and provide the same function as earlier games should you want to use them. Best of both worlds if you ask me, and it's steps like these in Let's Go that make it the most bearable iteration of Generation 1 in terms of exploration and progression. Alright. And before I forget, Let's Go basically deconfirms the Interpol agent of the SS Hand being Looker. Bit of a missed opportunity if you ask me. Now, while I've technically talked about gameplay up until this point, for the sake of this video, what I'll be calling gameplay from this point forward will be in reference to the combat, and other miscellaneous mechanics the game has that didn't really fit into anything mentioned previously. Combat across the many iterations of Generation 1 are wildly different, going from the unrefined start of the series to middling Generation 3, where the playstyle was budding into something resembling a more modern interpretation of the series' gameplay prior to Generation 6, and Generation 7's Let's Go games taking almost as many steps forward as it takes back, creating a mess of new and removed mechanics that rival the unrefined mess that was Generation 1. Playing through all these iterations was a trip, to say the least. But that's enough summarizing. Let's actually look at the combat mechanics for each iteration. Generation 1 is easily the worst gameplay the series has possessed, a case I hold to as it coincides with my earlier opinions regarding Generation 1, and due to its unrefined nature as the first entry in the series. Generation 1 presents a myriad of issues in the gameplay department, not least of which is the balance. Even to this day, Pokemon isn't exactly known for having a well-balanced combat system for competitive play, but it has, for the most part, been pretty solid for casual playthroughs. And Generation 1 is not. Not at all. For those not in the know, one of the biggest driving factors in the Gen 1 imbalance is the special stat. You see, prior to Generation 2, there was no separation between the special attack stat and the special defense stat, so Pokemon with a singular large special stat had an overwhelming advantage in battle, making Psychic-type Pokemon especially potent. Additionally, any checks to Psychic types, such as Bug and Ghost-type Pokemon, were also Poison types, making them vulnerable to the very thing they're supposed to be strong against. Not to mention the majority of Bug types were early game Pokemon that suffered due to the game's power creep. Additionally, despite the strong defensive typing, Dragon types didn't have any useful moves to take advantage of Stab, which is to say, same type attack bonus. Reason being, the only Dragon type move in Generation 1 is Dragon Rage, a move that does a flat damage rate of 40 damage regardless of attack buffs, debuffs, super, and not very effective attack hits. Meaning, even if you use it against another Pokemon that's weak to it, i.e. Dragon types, you wouldn't be able to receive a damage bonus of any sort. That said, Dragons were still exceptionally strong in Generation 1 in terms of casual play. Other factors that lead to the game's lack of balance were crit rates being tied to a Pokemon's speed stats. All moves, except for Swift, have a 1 in 256 chance of missing even with 100% accuracy, and this is less a balance issue and more of an annoyance, but moves like Wrap, Bind, Fire Spin, and Clamp prevent the recipient from attacking for the duration unless you switch your Pokemon out. Generation 1 is thoroughly unpleasant to play through in my opinion. I can certainly understand why some people might hold nostalgia for it, but despite it being my first video game ever, it has aged poorly and I do not like going back to it. Now this next bit applies to Generations 1 through 3, and is less an issue and more just plain interesting. In these generations, of which Fire Red and Leaf Green are part of, whether an attack was special or physical was dependent on the move's element rather than the name of the attack might imply. For instance, Fire, Ice, and Electric moves are all considered special, meaning that moves like Fire, Ice, or Thunder Punch all draw from the special stat, despite the name implying a physical interaction. Which also means Pokemon like Hitmonchan couldn't take advantage of them until Generation 4 onward. Honestly, Generation 3 probably has the best gameplay balance among the Gen 1 iterations. One of my favorite elements introduced to the series in this generation was Pokemon abilities, which are passive effects different Pokemon species get on their descriptions, ranging from attack boosts at low HP to preventing your enemies from escaping or swapping out Pokemon. And while it was pretty bare bones during Generation 3, it's nonetheless one of the best things about it, because it adds just a little bit extra combat strategy to general gameplay, without being so intrusive that it can't simply be ignored by players that are not ready for more complex strategies. Particularly in regards to Fire Red and Leaf Green, these remakes of Generation 1 greatly benefit from an increased move pool. This is most apparent at the start of the game, and while I didn't mention this earlier, your starter in Generation 1 would and could influence just how difficult the time you'd have in the early parts of the game, particularly against Brock. Squirtle and Bulbasaur would make the beginning of the game fairly easy in this regard because it gave the player moves that would take advantage of Brock's rock and ground type Pokemon weaknesses, whereas Charmander would make the game more challenging. In Generation 1, Charmander wouldn't have any moves early on that could exploit Brock's weaknesses. but wasn't necessarily at an overwhelming disadvantage since in Gen 1, Brock's team lacked any actual rock or ground type moves that could actually exploit Charmander's weakness. At worst, you were in for a very tedious Pokemon battle. Generation 3, as I mentioned, resolves this with an increased move pool, allowing Charmander to learn Metal Claw, a Steel-type move that is super effective against Brock's Pokemon. The trade-off being that Brock's Onix now has a Rock-type move in the form of Rock Tomb, which makes for a far less tedious fight with actual stakes, without coming at the cost of Bulbasaur and Squirtle's advantages. The game also benefits from having a separation of the special stat, and a better experience rate from Pokemon battles, which has the adverse effect of you possibly being overleveled if you focus on a single Pokemon for too long, but also makes maintaining a varied team far easier. However, the game doesn't necessarily encourage the use of varied Pokemon, and indeed the structure of the game does a poor job at preparing you for the endgame. Throughout the vast majority of the game, with the exception of gym leaders, most of the trainers you'll be fighting only utilize normal, rock, ground, poison, and grass-type Pokemon with the occasional water types. It incentivizes some variety to your team, but overall the majority of trainers are so uniform that it doesn't allow you to make a well-rounded team without giving up combat advantage. Fire Red's difficulty curve spikes hard at the Elite Four as a result. It's like a jump in 10 plus levels on everything. Black and White did this as well, but I feel like maintaining a well-balanced team was more doable than that. It's honestly because of this game's structure that I'm beginning to understand why Let's Go threw any semblance of balance out the window. It just makes the experience less tedious. I know I'm in a minority on this, but experience share for the whole party really is the best solution the Pokemon devs could have come up with. I can understand people doing more casual runs, not appreciating it, but for someone who likes to catch them all, it's very useful for raising a team with the Pokedex completion in mind. Now, Generation 7's Let's Go games is where balance gets incredibly weird again. Pokemon Let's Go maintains the increased move pool for Pokemon of the region, added the Fairy typing, since on its own, Fairy typing would almost be as ruinous to the balance as the special stat was in Gen 1, and, well, it still kind of is. They try, yes, at least they try to balance the game by adding in Alolan forms of Kanto Pokemon from Gen 7 to allow access to more type coverage like Dark and Steel-type Pokemon, but since most trainers in Let's Go are one-to-one the same as Yellow in terms of party compositions, these counters to Fairy types are largely pointless, so using Fairy types can still put you in an advantageous position. Particularly with Alolan Ninetales, which I personally think breaks the game's balance more than just about anything among the base form Pokemon. Let's Go also reintroduces Mega Evolution for the Kanto Pokemon that had it, which in addition to adding more type coverage, creates a unique scenario in which you can obtain all the stats and type benefits from Megas, but none of the unique abilities that could make some of them completely broken, such as Mega Kangaskhan's Parental Bond, which in earlier titles would have granted it the ability to attack twice in the same turn. So it's probably for the best that abilities weren't excluded. Though it's pretty easy to claim the game's balance is already completely broken regardless, which leads us up to Eevee and Pikachu, particularly your partner that you get at the beginning of the game. These two can easily be some of the most overpowered Pokemon you'll have through your run of the game. But why, you might ask? How is this unevolved Pokemon, nay, unevolvable Pokemon, so powerful? Well, that's simple, my friend, because they both possess perfect IVs and have some unique overpowered moves that they can be taught by a pervert with a whip and a lollipop. Some questions are better left unasked, and I don't think I'm prepared for the answer on this one. At any rate, the moves you can learn from this weirdo are pretty nuts. Pikachu, for instance, can learn a move that's a priority electric attack that always lands a crit, and Eevee can learn moves that are always able to inflict status effects or set up light screen or reflect after their use, giving you a solid defense following an already strong offense. Pikachu's move in particular is broken since it's the only move tutor move either Pokemon can learn that actually takes advantage of stab damage. I know it sounds like I'm complaining about balance, but I'm really not. I just find it interesting how they changed the game in so many ways, and in many ways I think Let's Go is simply embracing its brokenness, and I'd be lying if I said it wasn't fun as a result. especially considering this game won't likely have a competitive scene like the main series Pokemon games. Now to talk about stuff that didn't really fit anywhere else in this analysis. 1. Generation 1 has a backpack limit of 20 items, including key items, TMs, and HMs, and every other item, making it the only Pokemon game to basically require you store items in your PC for item management. Additionally, this being the first Pokemon game in the series, it also lacks any sort of item organization, so your backpack is basically just a mess of items arranged in no particular order beyond when they were obtained. Generation 2 onward did fix this by removing the item limit and added multiple storage pouches to your bag for you to sift through, which were very efficient. Which makes me wonder why the hell Let's Go made it a mess again. Granted, there's still no item limit, but the way you navigate the bag in Let's Go is almost as muddled as Gen 1. I'm at a loss, guys. I honestly can't think of a sensible reason for this change. I can only hope Generation 8 doesn't follow in its footsteps in this regard. 2. Pokemon following you is a feature that should be in every Pokemon game whenever the hardware allows for it. It's a nice bit of extra immersion into the world to be able to interact with your Pokemon, and if it's not in Gen 8, I will riot. I'm being facetious, of course, but it would be a wasted opportunity, especially when we're already aware that many of the animations already exist, and likely didn't get used on the recent 3DS titles due to hardware limitations, which the Switch in all likelihood doesn't suffer from. Basically what I'm saying is that Pokemon Let's Go's Pokemon companions are a good idea, and you can ride on Kangaskhan's shoulder with a Pika pouch, and that's alright. It's real good, guys. 3. The bike is gone in Let's Go, but it's replaced with the ability to ride certain Pokemon, so I'm okay with it. 4. Pokemon Go capture mechanics aren't my personal preferred playstyle because it feels less accurate than the now traditional format, though on that matter the Go mechanics do capture the feeling of the original Gen 1 games where your Pokeballs could straight up miss. Heck, I'm pretty sure that Pokemon in Gen 1 could just straight up be immune to certain Pokeballs if you didn't have the right one, and that got very annoying very fast. On a related note, I think one of the biggest shortcomings of Pokemon Let's Go's capture mechanics is how you're no longer able to fish for water-type Pokemon, limiting you severely on what water types you can have for your party for over half the game, meaning the only water types you can get until Fuchsia City are Magikarp, Squirtle, and if you can catch it in the wild, Eevee that is, Vaporeon. It's not too big a deal since you don't fight the fire and ground type gyms till late game, but it's still an unusual decision to say the least. Though I do gotta say, the ability to catch the original 3 starters in the wild is a fantastic addition to Let's Go, and it's something the main series needs to pick up. Doing so helps contextualize them in the world far better than simply offering them at the start. And not to completely undermine the existence of starters, this could be incentivized by giving the starters perfect IVs, much like Let's Go's Pikachu and Eevee. IVs almost definitely need to be thrown out the window, but if they must stay, I'd rather they do this for the starters at the very least. And on the subject of capturing, I'm of two minds about how Pokemon Let's Go implemented legendary counters with the timer. When up against the legendary birds, it's a pretty easy affair to defeat them within the 5-minute time limit, but I feel like Mewtwo's encounter is a bit too difficult to apply a 5-minute time limit to without turning off battle animations, or if you're using the handful of dark types in the game, which is something I don't like to do. It's also kind of annoying that turning off battle effects puts you at a tactical advantage. And 5. There's this odd little addition to the Team Rocket hideout wherein you directly control your partner Eevee or Pikachu to obtain the lift key, and this resolves the stupid Rocket grunt gag of them just dropping the key when you talk to them in the previous game, and presents a minor challenge to work around. However, this is the only instance in the game where you control your partner. It would have been interesting if they had done this a few more times, but as it stands, it's just a weird one-off mechanic. Now, the presentation of the games vary pretty wildly, almost as much as the gameplay itself. Needless to say, red, blue, and yellow are pretty bland looking in all honesty, not even having the same charm as the colorful sequels, Gold, Silver, and Crystal. That's not to say they're without redeeming features, but for the most part the visual design of Gen 1 was lacking, which is a big part of why I saw so many revisions between the Japanese red and green, the Japanese blue, which is also the American red, and yellow. they're for the most part identical, but the biggest and arguably the most important change between the different Game Boy improvements are, rather infamously, the Pokemon sprites. The difference being green and blue versions updates are pretty mixed for the most part, but for the most part blue improved on the art of the original green and red releases, but there were some mistakes. Yellow version is probably the most definitive version of the Generation 1 sprite work. Yellow also has the nifty little animations for Pikachu, which lend more visual personality to the game than just about anything else. Now, Fire Red and Leaf Green were made after the series was beginning to find its footing stylistically. Needless to say, visually, it's an overall improvement. Sprites are detailed, and while I can't say I'm overly fond of the Gen 3 aesthetic in Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald, it looks weirdly more appropriate in a Gen 1 remake. I'm still partial towards the Generation 4 art style, but in replaying these games I have found a new appreciation towards the Generation 3 art style, I think. There's nothing particularly remarkable about the art style of Gen 3, but I do gotta mention that I much prefer the more saturated color of the sprite-based Pokemon games over the washed-out 3D models of the 3DS onward. Which brings us to Let's Go. These games are kinda unique among the 3D entries, in that they go for a pastel style over the more traditional cel-shaded anime style of the other 3D entries, perhaps in an effort to differentiate itself from the core games in the Pokemon series. Granted, Let's Go is still anime style, but I hope it's clear enough what I mean. I think for the most part this pastel art direction looks good. It gets a bit dubious when it comes to the lighting of the Pokemon themselves, but it's never so off that it gets in the way of the game's visual appeal, and overall it makes the Kanto region pop to life like never before. The pastel style are particularly effective in the overworld, and when interacting with your Pokepals Pikachu and Eevee, which are freaking adorable. If I had to complain about anything in regards to Let's Go's visual style, it's the god-awful graphical user interface. And I don't just mean the navigation like I mentioned earlier, the menus themselves are just ugly. I assume they're trying to replicate the style of Go, but it lacks any sort of visual cohesion with the rest of the game, and it honestly makes me wonder if there was some sort of miscommunication in development. Seems unlikely given how long Game Freak has been working on these games, but nonetheless this stands out as the game's worst feature. Now, I don't feel qualified to talk about the music, but in what capacity I can, I think it's pretty solid. Pokemon music didn't really come into its own until Generation 2 in my opinion, but the compositions of Gen 1 are solid and really spring to life in Fire Red and Leaf Green, in addition to the beautiful renditions in Let's Go. Not much more to say, honestly. Generation 1 compositions aren't really my favorites by any means, but it's still pretty good. Well, while I can't say I 100% enjoyed my journey through all these games, I can at least say that I got more Kanto in my life than I ever wanted to. Other than that, the Gen 3 remakes probably provide the most definitive experience of the original Game Boy games, and while the same could technically be said for Let's Go, and while for me personally Let's Go is probably the best of the iterations, it's not entirely representative of what it was like to play through the original games, and I think there's value in playing either. If you want a less toothless experience, go with Fire Red, but Let's Go is definitely the version I'll be returning to the most. With that said, I hope you enjoyed my return from hiatus. Can't say exactly when the next video will be out, but it'll definitely be sooner than the last one was. Probably. I don't know how to end this video, so I hope it lit a fire under you.